Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Asaf Ramarowski. I am the Executive Director of the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, and it's once again my pleasure to welcome all of you to our latest webinar. This afternoon, we have the privilege and pleasure to have our friend and colleague, Michael Sharnoff, talk to us about the changing Jordanian attitudes towards the West Bank. Michael has been a longtime member and friend of ASMIA, and we're happy to have him here to discuss his latest research. He also wrote an article on this topic. He's currently an associate professor at the National Defense University's Near East and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies in DC. Before joining NESA, he served as an associate professor of the Middle East Studies and Director of Regional Studies at Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. He has taught and written a great deal about the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Middle East at large. He is the author of a great book, which I highly recommend to all of you to read, about Nasser's Peace, Egypt's response to the '67 war with Israel. And so he's done a great deal of research on these issues. The format this afternoon will be as follows. Those of you who have been with us in the past will know. Michael will talk for about a half hour or so, then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you got to do is type in your question, and we'll be able to read your questions. We apologize in advance if we don't get to all your questions this afternoon, but if we don't, we will follow up. You could email us afterwards, and we'll do our best to follow up as always. Michael, without further ado, really, it's a pleasure to have you. And the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Asaf and ASMIA, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Before I begin, I just wanted to mention that these are my views that you're about to hear and not those of the Department of Defense or any federal agency. And with that, I will pull up some slides for this presentation. Before we begin. And I would like to start with a quote by a Jordanian scholar that I thought would be appropriate to help set the context and the stage for this topic. At a lecture around 10 years ago, a Jordanian scholar named Tariq Altel said that, quote, even after 70 years of the existence of the Jordanian state, its boundaries are undecided. The boundaries in question refer to Jordan's relationship with the West Bank. Now, this may seem odd because when one thinks of boundaries in question or territorial disputes in the Middle East, one does not usually think of Jordan. In fact, official Jordanian policy recognizes the West Bank as an Israeli-occupied Palestinian land and supports the PLO to establish an independent state. However, the history of Jordan's attitudes and policies is complex and nuanced. Despite the kingdom's decision to disengage from the West Bank in 1988 and sign a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, Jordanians continue to debate the status of the West Bank and what role Jordan should play, at times even in defiance of official Hashemite policy. Under Jordanian rule from 1948 to 1967, Jordan recognized the West Bank as an integral part of the Hashemite kingdom. Jordan had occupied central Palestine during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and it renamed these lands the West Bank and merged the West Bank with the East Bank to form the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Jordan annexed the West Bank in 1950 and granted citizenship and passports to Palestinians on the West Bank. Jordan was the only Arab country to do this. Jordan described annexation as the unity of the two banks, and the regime justified the decision by declaring that Jordan had in fact rescued part of Arab Palestine, and that Jordan's control of the West Bank would be a temporary arrangement held in trust until a final solution to the Palestinian issue could be reached. Annexation was also justified and celebrated by the king and Jordanian regime officials who claimed that Jordanians and Palestinians were one people with a shared destiny, and that Jordan was Palestine and Palestine was Jordan. In addition to speeches by the regime, the West Bank was featured and celebrated as part of Jordan in popular culture, including books and postage stamps. As you will notice on the screen, I have two Jordanian postage stamps. The one on the left I wanted to compare was from 1946, and this is a series to celebrate Jordan's independence from the United Kingdom. And as we will all notice, the territory that is delineated consists solely of land east of the Jordan River. However, the image on the right-hand side shows a stamp that was issued in 1952 to commemorate the unity, the annexation of the West Bank from 1950. And this stamp that highlights the unity showcases two prominent images on both banks of the river: the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and Al-Kazne, a beautiful temple in Petra built by the Nabateans, which intends to showcase that the unification of Jordan and Arab Palestine had existed organically for centuries, as opposed to, as the historian Kimberly Katz observes, was being merged together for quick political expediency. West Bank Palestinians, reeling from their shock and defeat of their disaster during the 1948 war, were weak and divided, and they were generally suspicious of Hashemite ambitions and intentions to rule the West Bank. However, there was no serious movement among the Palestinians during this time to secede from the East Bank, and conditional legitimacy was granted to Jordan as long as Jordan fulfilled its promise of holding the West Bank in trust until a final resolution to the Palestine issue could be reached. As a result of the 1967 war, Jordan lost the West Bank to Israel. Yet Jordan continued to assert sovereignty claims on the West Bank and worked openly at venues like the United Nations, as well as covertly to restore the land under Hashemite rule. Jordanian popular culture also reflected regime attitudes toward the West Bank. If we look at postage stamps again as another example, Jordanian stamps throughout the 1970s continued to highlight the unity of the two banks, conveyed that Jordanians and Palestinians were one people with a shared destiny, and preserved the West Bank on maps in the hope that the territory would eventually return to Jordan. The stamp on the left was issued in 1973, and it celebrates the 50th anniversary of Jordan's semi-independence from the United Kingdom in 1923. And you will clearly see that the West Bank is demarcated as an integral part of the Hashemite Kingdom, even though Jordan had lost physical possession of the land to Israel during the 1967 war. Another example that we can see from the image on the right-hand side of the screen was a Jordanian postage stamp issued in 1975, which celebrates the 10th anniversary of Royal Jordanian Airlines. And if you can manage to make out the image of the map in the right logo behind the airplane, does indeed show the West Bank as part of Jordan. Palestinians on the West Bank, however, who had long viewed Jordanian rule as a temporary arrangement, increasingly after 1967 identified with the PLO and viewed the organization, and not Jordan nor any other Arab state, as the legitimate body to advance Palestinian rights. You'll notice here that while Jordanian postage stamps normally depict the West Bank as part of Jordan, even after Israel conquered the land in 1967, occasionally Jordanian postage stamps also feature and acknowledge that the West Bank is a Palestinian land, and they designate the land as it existed under the British Mandate for Palestine. The image on the left-hand side of the screen is a Jordanian postage stamp issued in 1965 of Deir Yassin, and there's no indication to suggest that the West Bank belongs to Jordan. It is clearly within the boundaries of mandatory Palestine. The stamps on the right-hand side of the screen were issued in 1973. They were titled Palestine Week. And once again, there's no indication to suggest that the West Bank is or should be perceived as part of Jordan. It is clearly within the boundaries of the original Palestine Mandate. Now, on the one hand, there was nothing unusual about the issuing of these types of stamps, the Deir Yassin series or the Palestine Week series, because other Arab countries had also issued these stamps. But what is notable and significant is that Jordan was the only Arab country during this time that asserted sovereignty claims over a part of Palestine or former Palestine, which was the West Bank. So there is this dynamic perception among Jordan of being able to convey that the West Bank at the same time is both a Jordanian territory, but also recognizing that it's a Palestinian land or that it should belong to the Palestinians, especially based on the 1950 annexation, because that was stipulating that Jordan's control of the West Bank would be held in trust temporarily, provisionally, until the final status could be reached with the Palestinians. After 1967, Jordan continued to work toward recovering the West Bank. And when United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 was passed in November 1967, Jordan interpreted this resolution as a clear call for the West Bank to return to Jordan. Jordan remained committed to restoring the West Bank and was not deterred, even after the insurgency between the Jordanian army and the Fedayeen during 1970 to 1971, also known as Black September. The PLO, after 1967, had essentially set up a state within a state in Jordan, using Jordan as a base of operations, which threatened the stability of the Hashemite monarchy. And the PLO was ultimately expelled from Jordan in 1971. King Hussein sought to capitalize on PLO weakness during this time, and in 1972 floated a proposal to regain the West Bank by reorganizing Jordan into a united Arab kingdom. The East Bank would become the Jordanian province, and the West Bank would become the Palestinian province. Amman would serve as the federal capital, and the overall responsibility for defense, policy, and security issues would remain in control in Jordan, in Amman. The PLO and Israel rejected this plan, along with most other regional countries. And throughout the 1970s, the PLO's influence steadily grew. And as PLO influence grew regionally, King Hussein was forced to go along, however reluctantly, with a decision at the 1974 Arab League Summit in Rabat, which recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. After 1974, Jordan publicly supported the PLO to be responsible for the fate of the West Bank. Yet Jordan continued to maintain its open bridges policy, connecting the West Bank with the East Bank, and preserved West Bankers with Jordanian citizenship, and also exerted diplomatic efforts to recover the West Bank. However, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, Jordan became increasingly alarmed that its longtime slogan, that Jordan is Palestine, could be weaponized by Israel. Israeli leaders like Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin were proponents of the idea that there was no need for the creation of a Palestinian state because, they argued, Jordan was the legitimate homeland for the Palestinians. Jordanians describe this scenario as the alternative homeland conspiracy and fear that Israel could expel the Palestinians on the West Bank to the East Bank, or somehow work to transform Jordan into a Palestinian state. Fear of this conspiracy in Jordan lingers to this day. And for these reasons, by the early 1980s, Jordan stops declaring that Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan. And it makes one last concerted effort to reconcile and work together with the PLO in order to restore the West Bank through a confederation in 1985. However, Jordan accused Yasser Arafat of reneging on pledges to support UN Resolution 242, and by 1986, the initiative collapses. In 1987, the first Palestinian intifada, or uprising against Israeli rule, breaks out, and Jordan fears that instability on the West Bank could spill over into the East Bank. And in July 1988, King Hussein decided once and for all to sever the legal, administrative, and economic links with the West Bank, which included the cancellation of a Jordanian development program for the West Bank and replacing the Ministry of Occupied Territory Affairs with a political department in the Foreign Ministry. To demonstrate that Jordan was not Palestine, would not be a substitute Palestinian homeland, and that the PLO would now be solely responsible for achieving their own objectives, Jordan began a controversial process of revoking Jordanian citizenship from West Bank Palestinians. King Hussein also pledged in his disengagement speech that the decision would not negatively affect Jordanians of Palestinian origin, who comprise the majority of the population. Jordanians, especially East Bank nationalists, welcomed and supported disengagement in the belief that it would finally allow the kingdom to prioritize the East Bank. Jordan had sacrificed more than any other Arab country, they argued, and it was time to enable the Palestinians to chart their own course independent of Jordan and fully implement the 1974 Arab League decision to recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinians. Other Jordanians, however, were surprised by the disengagement and expressed shock. For example, former Jordanian Prime Minister Tahir al-Masri describes in his memoirs how he believed the disengagement from the West Bank would undermine the Jordanian role in international venues. Masri resigned from his post at the time, although he would later reemerge in government. After the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, Jordan became the second Arab country to terminate its state of belligerency with Israel and recognize its right to exist. The 1994 Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty recognized that the West Bank did not belong to Jordan and placed the Jordanian-Israeli boundary along the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers. And yet, despite the disengagement decision and peace treaty with Israel, Jordanians periodically debate the status of the West Bank. These debates usually surface during times of stress and conflict, such as the Second Intifada or the mini wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza in 2008, 2012, and 2014. They can also appear during peace talks, especially if Jordanians suspect that an arrangement may be reached at the expense of Jordan and the Palestinians. In the past decade, some prominent Jordanian politicians and commentators have renewed the conversation about Jordan's role in the West Bank. Some advocate that Jordan had never truly abandoned sovereignty over the West Bank, while others have adopted a more extreme position that the West Bank should revert to Hashemite rule. For example, in 2012, former Crown Prince Hassan told a Palestinian audience in Nablus that Jordan had never renounced its claim to the West Bank and that the territory comprised an integral part of the Hashemite kingdom. Some observers speculate that the former Crown Prince may have merely been floating a trial balloon to test or gauge Palestinian public reaction to such claims, and therefore such views should be perceived as a one-off. Yet, other Jordanian officials have made similar marks since then. In May 2016, for instance, a Jordanian parliamentarian went to Hebron to discuss a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation. Such a topic would normally be considered taboo, as the Jordanian government routinely says that there is no need for talk of confederation. The primary objective is ending Israeli rule and the establishment of a Palestinian state. In October 2017, Jawad Anani, former Jordanian deputy prime minister and foreign minister, claimed that UN Resolution 242 made Amman the only legitimate claimant to the West Bank. He cited the 1952 Constitution, which prohibited in Article 1 relinquishing any Jordanian territory. In January 2018, Kamal Abu Jaber, a Jordanian senator and former foreign minister, announced in an interview that the kingdom's disengagement decision was a tactical ploy, and it did not represent a political or religious break with the Palestinians, and that Jordan, quote, did not give up sovereignty on the West Bank. In April 2018, former Jordanian Prime Minister Taher al-Masri called for the Palestinian Authority to be dissolved and for its leader, Mahmoud Abbas, to resign. In November 2021, Hassan Ismail, a Jordanian entrepreneur with a substantial following on social media, wrote an article calling for Jordan to re-annex the West Bank and to rebrand Jordan as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Palestine as a way to help the Palestinians achieve self-determination. In a sense, there wasn't anything new in Hassan Ismail's article because it follows a pattern of Jordanian conversations debating the West Bank even after the 1988 disengagement decision. What is new, however, is that such debates usually occur inside Jordan among Jordanians and in Arabic. Ismail's article was published in Foreign Policy, a popular American magazine, and written in English. What has traditionally been a private and sensitive domestic matter for Jordanians is spilling over into mainstream press for a wider audience. To be sure, reactions to Ismail's article were mixed. They were largely negative, although not exclusively. Former Prime Minister Samir Rifai even took to Twitter to criticize the article. So why after all these years would some Jordanians advocate for a renewed role in the West Bank? There are several explanations. For some Jordanians, the 1988 disengagement decision should not be understood as solely a political decision to satisfy the demands of the PLO and Arabs during a very specific period in history. The decision, they argue, is tactical, but not legal, because Jordan never amended its 1952 constitution to formalize the disengagement. For other Jordanians, the issue of a renewed role in the West Bank paradoxically has to do with defending and protecting Jordanian national interests. While the 1988 decision to disengage from the West Bank sought to defend and protect Jordanian and Palestinian rights, some Jordanians have come to the conclusion that after nearly 30 years since Oslo, the PLO has failed to achieve its objectives of establishing an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank. Jordan, and not the PLO, with its close working relationship with Israel and the United States, has a better chance, they argue, of ending Israeli rule on the West Bank and facilitating self-determination for the Palestinians. Palestinians are too weak and divided, they claim, and show no signs of unity and unifying between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Fatah in the West Bank. Moreover, President Trump's Peace to Prosperity plan, known as the Deal of the Century, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's pledge to annex part of the West Bank has resurrected fears in Jordan about a plot to transform the kingdom into an alternative Palestinian homeland. So in a sense, when Jordanians debate the West Bank, they are not doing so to have their country by any means become an alternative Palestinian homeland or to implement any so-called Jordanian option. Instead, they believe that Jordan must take a more proactive role toward what happens west of the river and not be a passive observer. Otherwise, they fear a solution to the Palestinian issue may be forced upon them one day, which would undermine the stability of the Hashemite crown and bury the Palestinian cause. And while it must be stated that these are minority opinions which do not reflect official Jordanian policy, such views will likely linger and persist as long as peace remains elusive between Israelis and Palestinians. And when these debates do occur, they will likely reawaken Palestinian suspicion that Jordan seeks to dominate or influence their national movement, resume control of the West Bank, and prevent the possibility of an independent Palestinian state. And with that, looking at the time, I want to thank you all for your attention, and we'll pause here for any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Well, so for the, again, a lot of information, and obviously for for the very erudite summary of what we're seeing here today, and Jordanian politics. I have a question, and I'm sure that Alex has a question as well before we turn it over to the audience. So, Alex, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So first of all, thanks very much for a terrific overview and presentation that goes back to the origins of all these questions. I was especially amused. Amused isn't really the word. Struck by the way that the concept of Jordan is Palestine was first a Jordanian concept and then was adopted by essentially the Israeli right. It's one of those typical ironic reversals characteristic of the Middle East. My question, I guess, is first of all, what do Jordanian economic elites have to say about these trial balloons related to Jordan reestablishing some kind of control or relationship with the West Bank? It's one thing for the politicians to float these things, but it's another thing for the people who make the Jordanian economy go to think about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you very much. As these views, which I mentioned, are normally articulated by members of the Jordanian elites, politicians, journalists, analysts, etc., they are a minority opinion. So if Jordanian economic elites were to look at such proposals, they first and foremost, and this is very important just to be absolutely clear, they would want to make sure that any talk of confederation or the possibility of some type of merger or union with the West Bank could only come after, as they would argue, the creation of an independent Palestinian state. It would not precede that, because from their perspective, if that were the case, Jordanians would feel that all they would be doing would be replacing their military with Israel's military to control the West Bank. And that's not something that they would like to do. But with economic links, I mean, Jordanians routinely mention that the West Bank is one of their closest trading partners. It's one of their closest cultural and political partners. I mean, the relationship between both banks of the river does go back for quite a time. Many members on the East Bank have family in the West Bank and vice versa. So there's nothing especially controversial about the possibility of establishing a confederation if it were subject to a referendum on both sides and agreed to only after the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, as I think that would be something that Jordanians would support for trade purposes, but also for that kind of cultural familial ties that have existed for many decades and centuries.
Great. Thank you for that. My question is, before we turn over to the audience, and I think the one aspect that wanted to dive into a little bit is, of course, the religious dimension. We didn't talk about Jerusalem and obviously the factor of the Waqf into this entire political ideology. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that and how that plays into these internal politics that you're seeing play out with these Jordanian options, whether it's coming from Jordanians or the Israeli right, for that matter.
Yeah, thank you, Asaf. The issue of Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Eastern Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, had also been annexed and formally incorporated into the Hashemite kingdom in 1950, along with the West Bank. Jordan has historically prided itself as the custodian of the holy places, the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and they cite the justification for their influence and their reason to exert that prestige and control over the holy sites, dating back actually to 1924, when Palestinian Arabs appealed to the Hashemites to help protect Jerusalem and renovate Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the old city of Jerusalem had been part of Jordan from 1948 to 1967, but when Israel regained control after the 1967 war, Jordan continued to play that role of guardianship of the holy sites. With disengagement from the West Bank in 1988, that status was excluded. So Jordan would disengage from the West Bank except for its custodianship over the holy sites. And that position, that Jordanian position of guardianship over the holy sites, was enshrined in the 1994 peace treaty with Israel. And it was later reaffirmed by Mahmoud Abbas of the PLO to grant Palestinian public acceptance of that role. So that's a longstanding role that the Jordanians have played in Jerusalem, managing the Waqf, the holy sites, the guardianship over Al-Aqsa. And it's a role that is respected and supported by all the key players, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And Jordan, to this day, what they say in respect to their position with Al-Aqsa, with their guardianship in Jerusalem, is that the guardianship over Jerusalem is a Hashemite responsibility, but sovereignty, or the ultimate sovereignty, would be a Palestinian responsibility and privilege or right in the event that Palestinians exercise their self-determination.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, and just a reminder, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A and we will do our best to get to all of them and pitch them to Dr. Sharnoff. So the first question we have here is from Adi Schwartz, and they write, Sharnoff says that support for renewed interest in Jordanian rule in the West Bank should by no means be understood as endorsing the Jordanian option. In what sense not? And how do they understand such a renewed rule vis-a-vis a final status agreement between Israel, the Palestinians, and Jordan?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you very much. When Jordanians make the argument, and again, this is a controversial and minority position about renewed claims or a renewed role in the West Bank, they are not looking to share that responsibility with Israel by divvying up the West Bank, where Israel could still exert control over the West Bank and have sovereignty in certain regions, but Jordan would also be responsible too, similar to the Alone plan that was floated around after 1967. Nor do these Jordanians advocate that they replace the Israeli military in ruling over or being perceived to be as an occupying force. Rather, what they're really trying to argue is an active role is needed, and some type of union should be considered, but only after the establishment of a Palestinian state, only after ending Israeli rule. And Jordanians who use the argument of the flaws of the disengagement decision, that it's illegal, they use the Constitution, they try to justify that as evidence to say that Jordan still should be the legitimate claimant to negotiate the recovery of the West Bank, not the PLO or anyone else. Jordan is in a much better position to do that, they argue. It has a much closer relationship with the key players, the United States, with Israel. They're a stronger player to do that, and they would be more successful as opposed to the PLO, which, as I mentioned, almost had 30 years now to try and achieve this objective. So I do want to make sure that we distinguish that when those claims are made, they're not looking to replace Israeli rule, to be perceived as occupiers, or to carve up and divvy up the West Bank alongside with Israel and mutually rule it. Instead, they're looking to use what they perceive to be as their legitimate right to negotiate an end to Israeli rule over the West Bank. But they always stress, and they go out of their way to say this, when those people do make those types of arguments, that this is not to create some type of substitute alternative homeland, but rather it's really to help defend and protect Palestinian and Jordanian interests. Otherwise, they fear that in the absence of some type of unity between the Palestinians or solution between Israelis and Palestinians, another exodus of Palestinians on the West Bank could flee into the East Bank and cause additional stresses for the regime.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next question we have here is from Steve Onyewu, and he asks, do you see any significant difference between King Hussein and King Abdullah's attitudes towards the West Bank?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think whereas King Hussein had floated various proposals going back to the Federation proposal in 1972, as well as the Confederation program proposal with the West Bank in 1985, that he was more open, I think, at different times to consider Confederation, but he ultimately in the mid 1990s, insisted that the time was not right to discuss that, and such talk could or should only occur after Palestinians achieve self-determination. King Abdullah, since assuming the throne from his father in 1999, has been far more consistent in avoiding any type of public talk which could even insinuate hints that Jordan is looking for some type of renewed role. He actually, King Abdullah, periodically goes out of his way to say that Jordan is Jordan and Palestine is Palestine, meaning Palestine is or should be the territory west of the river. And even recently, when the issue of confederation came up, King Abdullah sarcastically shot it down by remarking, confederation with who? Because it implies that you're going to confederate with another country. So for the most part, I would say that King Abdullah, since assuming the throne, has been probably more consistent in not wanting to bring up the confederation issue and maintaining that public Jordanian position that Jordan supports the PLO. It does not support the West Bank as belonging to Jordan, and that the West Bank is an Israeli-occupied Palestinian land that should constitute part of an independent Palestinian state.
Thank you. Our next question is from Joel Parker, and he writes, the Syrian side here perhaps deserves to be mentioned, as Hafez al-Assad was the main patron of Arafat and the PLO from 1970 until really the mid-1980s. Do you think Syria perhaps worked against Jordan and any possible unification plan?
It's a great question, and it is worth mentioning the Syrian role. Syria and Jordan have a very complicated history. At times, they have conspired against one another. They have also competed for influence over the right to represent the Palestinians. And it is true that Syria had under Hafez al-Assad its own interpretation of Palestine or the Palestinian Liberation Organization and what that should be or what that should look like with respect to self-determination. So, the short answer is that there was not a lot of cooperation and unity throughout much of that period. Syria and Jordan often competed for regional influence over the right to represent the Palestinians. And I would also add that Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser also was a fierce competitor with Jordan. And Egypt under Nasser, unlike Syria, Egypt had also occupied from 1948 to 1967 territory that the Palestinians now claim to be or should be part of their state, which is the Gaza Strip. So there was that competition that Jordan faced from Syria, from Egypt, from other Arab countries, which had a more peripheral role. So that I think is important to acknowledge. But what Jordanians would like to remind us all when it comes to these issues and how they see sort of the West Bank and the PLO is they argue that Jordan, more than any other Arab country, has borne the largest brunt of responsibility. They've shouldered the biggest burden to try and defend and protect Palestinian interests. So when they propose these types of solutions of unity, they're making that argument of that long-standing history that Jordan has with the West Bank and its experience governing its people. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Great. Okay, so the next question is from Lillian Frost, and she writes, thanks for this presentation. What do these pro-unity Jordanian individuals say about the Gaza Strip? Would Gaza be part of this unity? If not, what would it become? Similarly, what do they say about the Gazan refugees in Jordan? Do they envision these refugees as receiving access to Jordanian nationality under such a unity?
Another terrific question. Thank you so much. With respect to the Gaza Strip, usually it is omitted from the conversations only because Jordan did not rule over the Gaza Strip. Egypt did. However, in King Hussein's federal plan in 1972, the Gaza Strip was actually floated as a possible land that could be joined to form the United Arab Kingdom if it were to be liberated, if there were to be a referendum which supported such a move. So it was actually considered to be possible to not only include the West Bank in part of this federal proposal, but to also include the Gaza Strip. In Hassan Ismail's article that I mentioned in Foreign Policy, which was published in November 2021, he also included the Gaza Strip as a potential territory that could join and receive all the benefits and privileges of defense and security as part of this, what he calls, rebranding Jordan as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Palestine. So to answer your question, at times, yes, the Gaza Strip is suggested that under certain circumstances, it could or should be considered to join in some type of merger with Jordan, but usually it's not. With respect to the refugees, the Palestinian refugees in Jordan that originally come from Gaza that do not have Jordanian citizenship, Jordan maintains its position of advocating for the right of return for Palestinian refugees in the hopes that if this were to happen, that the refugees in Jordan would elect to move to the future Palestinian state. Most Palestinians in Jordan do have citizenship, including the refugees, but Gaza had been a separate case as it had not been territory formally under the rule of the Hashemite Kingdom.
Great, thank you. So this next question is asked by an individual who is identifying themselves by the initials MMF. And they write, is there any sympathy amongst the Palestinians, politicians, or business leaders for confederation with Jordan?
There is the possibility, yes, for sympathy for confederation, because once again, this is not necessarily an old idea by any means. This was an idea that Yasser Arafat and other PLO members have long floated. But when Palestinians mention this, they emphasize and underscore that there could only be the possibility of a confederation with Jordan, once again, and not to sound like a broken record, after Palestinian independence, not prior to. The official Palestinian position, even the popular position among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, is supporting ending Israeli rule over those lands and establishing an independent Palestinian state. Once that happens, they are very open to the concept of holding a referendum to discuss whether or not the West Bank could or should join Jordan. So in that case, if you establish that first, that Palestinians recognize that they prioritize ending Israeli rule and the creation of a sovereign state, there is a significant, perhaps a plurality support in polls that suggest that they would like to rejoin Jordan, but not prior to, only after the fact. And that's the important thing to reiterate.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, We have like just a few more minutes, so if anyone has a question, they want to type it into the Q&A, we can pose it to Dr. Sharnoff. If not,
Well, let me chime in then. This is Alex Jaffe here with a question that struck me. You know, you've been talking, and the questions have been oriented towards you know, the Jordanians and the Palestinians in this kind of disequilibrium. Who wants what? Who thinks what? And the Israelis have their own opinions, and a little bit with the Syrians. But I wonder really what the rest of the Arab world thinks about this idea and about this core relationship. And obviously the Palestinian concept has been a core organizing feature of the Arab world, at least maybe until recently, and Gulf states and lots of other places have been funding various all of these parties. So I wonder what the Gulf states and what Egypt and what North African states really think about this relationship and what they're. Obviously the ideal would be, yes, for Palestinian independence, and then they can do whatever they want. But what do they really think? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. And on the one hand, we have all seen through the signing of the Abraham Accords that some Arab and Muslim countries are no longer waiting until the Israelis and Palestinians sign an agreement. They are eager and ready to normalize and establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And that's a remarkable achievement. I mean, this is unprecedented because for so many years, the official Arab position had always been no peace, no recognition, no normalization with Israel until a resolution to the Palestinian issue could be found. But that's clearly not the case anymore. It doesn't mean that these Arab countries like the UAE and Bahrain, for example, don't sympathize or empathize or still want to show solidarity with the Palestinians, but clearly it's no longer the priority that first a Palestinian state must be reached. But having said that, and the Middle East has changed, and it is changing significantly in the past 20 years, just with the Abraham Accords as one example. But at the same time, I'm not sure I see a lot of evidence in the Arab region, generally speaking, where there would be support or an appetite for, say, Jordan to have the confidence to overturn the 1974 Rabat Summit and become, once again, the spokesperson and negotiator on behalf of the Palestinians, or to cancel and overturn King Hussein's disengagement decision, if that were believed to be to help facilitate some type of self-determination or unity between the West Bank and Jordan. I don't really see a lot of evidence, if any, to suggest that the Arab countries have any interest in making those changes, let alone that the Jordanian, Hashemite royal court, that they have any stomach or any interest whatsoever in resuming their former role in the West Bank.
Great, thank you for that, Michael. And thank you, Alex, for the last question, and for everybody for joining us this afternoon. I know I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and so that will be our last question for this afternoon. But I really want, again, Michael, I want to thank you again for taking the time to share your research with us and share your latest work. Obviously, it's a fluid situation, and obviously an issue and a topic that there's a lot to discuss. And so hopefully you can come back also with new developments, and we can have you back again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you all again very much for your time.